Hello, everyone, and welcome to a late night author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, and today we have a author making their official debut here on the show. My guest has always loved to escape reality and enter the daydreaming world of reading and writing. Yet her dreams of being a jet-setting journalist slash writer weren't in her future. She repurposed her creative juices into receiving a bachelor's in civil engineering at the University of Central Florida. After several years in the professional world, she realized that the characters inside her head would not shut up and begged for their stories to be told. The struggle for all authors.
Yes.
After digging through her collection slash obsession with books and too many journals, she found her unfinished stories and dove back into storytelling through short stories, poetry, and novels. When she's not writing, she enjoys reading, lounging in the pool to escape the Florida heat, taking evening walks with her husband, dancing to the congas of her Latin culture in the middle of her living room, and she secretly loves kung fu movies and takes online kickboxing classes in hopes of one day becoming a true ninja. And besides reading and writing and kickboxing and all of the wonderful stuff, her obsession with work also allows her to balance out her enthusiasm for food, especially gourmet meals prepared by her husband, who is a talented cook. And you can find her living in the sunny life of Central Florida, where she is enjoying fantastic adventures with her supportive husband and children. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, author of dystopian novels and sci fi fantasy novels, Ivette Diaz. Ivette, thank you so much for coming out this evening.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem, Yvette. Now, before we dive into your book, is there anything else you'd like to add about your background?
So when you requoted that, I was thinking, geez, I keep myself busy. I think I'm a very like type A, always on the go type of person. And my grandmother was like that. And I see so much of myself in her as I've been getting older. That's pretty much a lot of what I do. I consider myself a Floridian now. I'm originally from the Midwest area, my husband and I both. But I've been here long enough, longer than I've lived there. So even though I still consider that my home, this is officially my home. So yeah, I like doing all the things where I think when you live in Central Florida, you get pass holders, you become pass holders for all the parks and you go whenever you want. So that's kind of the cool part. But there are also great spots here in Florida that the tourists don't go to. And once you've dealt with the tourists, you're like, let me find some other places to check out. So we've been doing that a lot lately, which is a lot of fun. Besides, of course, the reading and the writing and all of the stuff. And then I also work full time. So I wish writing, being an author, was my full time job. I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of authors that are like that, that have to balance this work
Yes.
and writing play just side by side. So that is what I do. I have to work full time, which is completely opposite than my writing world. And I think I like it like that. I just like to escape my work world and get into the writing world whenever I can.
And I'm actually of the, same mind. Like I write on the side. I, have my regular job, which is as a tutor. So I completely understand the hustle and bustle. And speaking of writing, Yvette, would you like to share with us a little teaser of your book, if I'm not mistaken, Chaos of Power, is it? If I'm not mistaken?
Choice, choices of power.
Choices of Power. Okay.
Yes, the I am crown. Don't worry, I called it Power of Choices one time, and I'm like, it's my book. I should know what it's called. I named it. Yeah, so Choices of Power, the I Am Chronicles, is book one in my series, and it's a YA sci-fi dystopian novel. It takes
Ooh.
place about 40 years after the world is pretty much destroyed by nuclear war. So the fallout of the nuclear effects affects the surviving human race, and they are altered and changed to all have superpowers. So each person has a specific type of power that is
Ooh, okay.
so it centers around my main character, Simone. And in the beginning, she battles grief and has a big loss in her life. And so, as of course, an enemy is trying to upend the balance of power. And so, while he's doing that, and all this craziness is going on in her life, she is trying to hold on to her home, keeping it safe, while also trying to hold on to her relationship with her best friend, Tremont, who's also the man she's in love with. So, if you like X-Men mixed with Divergence, then you'll love this book.
Awesome. That actually reminds me of another book I read, actually a graphic novel, Nuclear Power, which is very much the same. And for viewers who don't know nuclear power, that is pretty much, imagine the Cuban Missile Crisis just going south and America gets nuked and pretty much becomes the Cuba of that world, with almost all of the western half of the United States pretty much turned to no man's land, with the original 13 colonies becoming the American Union, run by the Joint Chiefs of Staffs. And, you know, from what you told me just now, Ivette, I instantly think of that with, you know, superpowers, dystopian worlds, and just everything. So that is amazing. So now let's dive into a little bit more about you. So growing up, were you always a creative person, dabbling in stories, or did that come later in life?
It's funny, I would have probably said no because I ended up going in the civil engineering route. But when I look back, I was always creating stories. I was a daydreamer. I loved just daydreaming stuff, and I would create stories in my head. And I did create a lot of stories. I even created, now that I remember, I created a comic book with my cousin.
Ooh.
And we were doing the, I mean, we were like 11, 12. And we created a comic book where all of us cousins, because there's a bunch of us, I'm Latina, so there's like 20 of us, of course, and all about the same age, and we all had superpowers. And I remember that I thought maybe that's where my inspiration came from. So yeah, I think that I started out journaling, and then eventually it turned into writing stories, which were very cringy, you know, teenage angst stories that I hope my mom got rid of, but I have a feeling she has them hidden somewhere to blackmail me. But yeah, I guess I always was, and I just never realized that I really had that creative itch ever since I was young.
Interesting. Now, also in your bio, it says that, you know, as it says, your characters never stopped talking in your head and wanted to have their stories told. So walk us through that. What was the official, definitive aha moment when you realized, okay, enough's enough. I've had these characters with me for so many years. Let's put them down on paper and let's actually make a book with them. So walk us through that moment.
Yes, so I tried to ignore the writing part of me, even though it was always there, because, of course, at the time, everybody was telling me, oh, being an author isn't a viable career. You're not going to make any money. You're not going to do anything. So, of course, they wanted something more prestigious. Engineering was prestigious to them. But as I really got into the field, there was always something missing. There was always a part of me that longed to write. And like I said, those characters, I was always daydreaming up some story. So funny enough, I received a journal from my mom as a Mother's Day gift, and I just started writing in it. And I didn't really know where the story was going. I always I have a bunch of half-written novels and all these different journals because I like to write freehand instead of type. It's more creative for me.
All right.
Yeah, having to recreate it on the computer, that's like my editing moment, and I hate it, but I write better when I actually write. So I actually started to pursue it more when I was like, where is this story going? I need some help. So that's when I signed up for some webinars and some classes just to learn how to write better and really hone my craft because I was so passionate about it. And once I did that, it was like, this is where this is going. This is what I was going to do. And when I invested in myself, I knew this was something that I was going to go after.
Awesome. So now let's fast forward ahead to when you finally began, you know, drafting Choices of Power. So when you began drafting it, what were the goals you had for this story going forward, but also the goals and promises you had for your future readers?
So at first I didn't have any. I was just writing for myself because I just wanted to write. But then I realized, especially in the dystopian genre, it always feels so bleak and dire. And
Right.
I'm such a person of hope. I always believe that there's hope, like a silver lining in everything.
Hmm.
So I really wanted my stories to showcase that there was hope. And I mean,
Right.
I wanted the drama, I wanted the action, the dystopian feel, but I wanted people and readers to really find their own selves within the pages of my books, but then
Right.
also see that there is hope in there and know that there is hope even in the darkest of times.
That's amazing. That is actually really, really true because if you think about like the dystopian genre, and I'm gonna be honest, like I don't read a lot of dystopian stories, but from the get go, it's a very bleak genre. Like the world building, like there's no hope. I think probably the best one that I can think of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like the Hunger Games is probably what most people would consider as the or one of the definitives dystopian genres or dystopian stories in recent years. But I like how you said how even if it is bleak, there is some hope at the end, which will actually lead to later questions down the road. But before you get to that, so once you got your editor, you got your cover artist, you formatted the book exactly the way you want it, it's out for publication, boom, it's out there in the world. What was the initial reaction like from your readers and your audience? Were they positive, negative, mixed? And what about friends and family too? What was their reaction when you told them that, hey, I just published my first book?
So I think because I have been talking about it for so long, I think a lot of people really didn't believe it was going to happen, and they're like, "Oh, there's
Mm,
just another person." And then when I actually did it, the response was very positive. I was actually surprised because a lot of my coworkers, they heard me mention it, not too much, but they heard me mention it, and they all got FOMO and ended up buying copies and asking me to sign it. So my first like signing was at work, and it was kind of weird because I'm at my desk trying to do my contracts work, and I'm sitting here signing my book. But it was really cool at the same time. And I think the biggest surprise for me was my family because they were like, oh, oh, you're publishing a book. That's cute. Oh, you're self publishing. That's really cute. And then when they read it, they said, wow, it's actually good. I'm like,
mm-hmm.
doubted me. So I was kind of offended at first, but then I realized it was a positive response because so many people say that they're going to publish. So many people say they're going to write a book, publish it.
Right.
I followed through on it, and it actually was professional. It was done professionally. I took my time. I took the correct steps. And when it came across, I'm glad that I got the response that I did from them, especially. My family's not one of those families like, oh, they support me, but they'll let you know if it's not
Right.
good. So I'm glad they thought it was good.
That's awesome. And from those reactions from friends and family and your audience, did they in a way validate your goals that you had, which was to tell this story that's been with you from the beginning?
Yes. So one of the things that I really wanted to come across was my main character is actually several of the main characters, they're Latinos and
Mm,
they're Afro Latinos. And growing up, I didn't really see that as this positive, especially a positive female Latino role model who was
mm,
this powerful person, but also
right.
feminine at the same time. So I think the first time I ever saw someone like that was Storm in the cartoon of X-Men. And I was
Right.
like, finally, I see somebody, she's not completely like me. But one of the things, when I came out with the book, about a couple weeks later, one of my friends came up to me and she said, I had to get your book. I showed it to my daughter. We saw what Simone looked like on the cover,
Mm,
and my daughter looks like her. And I looked at her and I looked at the daughter and I said, oh my gosh, she does. And so she said, I really wanted somebody, I wanted my daughter to have someone she can relate to. And that got me
right.
so excited because that's what I really wanted. I wanted somebody to relate to the book. And so it was great to hear feedback that people were relating to the book, that people were relating to the characters and getting excited about the story.
That's amazing. And that's actually kind of the same sentiment I've gotten from my last few guests on the show. One of my guests who writes fantasy stories but weaves in African American mythology and African folklore. It's just incredible. And, when we think of like the fantasy setting, especially like, high fantasy or just epic fantasy, we usually think of in medieval Europe or maybe in Islamic world, or sometimes even in China or even Japan. But we never really take into consideration that genre, that style of writing, can go everywhere. You can have high epic fantasy in the U.S. You can have high epic fantasy Mexico, South America, anywhere. And reading his stories, well, reading one of them by Sea and Sky, a Sky Pirate story, it's just fascinating. And going back to what you said about being seen and being represented, that reminds me of a comic series by Caden Phoenix, an LA-based author here in California, who wrote the Alabrava series. And I'm so angry I don't have it right next to me. It's like right across, but I can't reach it. But this is it's a superhero team that she created about 5 Latino women from different parts of the Latin community. One's from Mexico, one's from a border town in Texas and Mexico, one's from Florida, one's from East LA, and one's from Brooklyn, New York. But they're all from different backgrounds of the Latin community, and they all deal with real issues that affect women in the United States or women in general. And sometimes they impact, stories that affect the Latin community, or sometimes one of them, Ruka, who dealt with a very heavy one, which was trafficking, global trafficking. And that was a very, very huge topic, but it's woven respectfully where it's in your face, but you're not going to be repulsed by it, which I think that is the testament of an incredible author that's honed their craft. And now more than ever, I want to get Choices of Power and add it to my collection, because from what you just told me, that it's so amazing and inspiring. And that leads into this next question, which I'm eager to hear your thoughts on. So, as in your bio states, you've had this story among many others in your head for a long time. You've had these characters, you've known them, you knew what was going to happen in their lives and so forth. And when you sat down and started writing, I imagine it was a little intimidating, little daunting at first, but then over time you found your stride and you found your voice. And that's the one thing about, for us indie authors, it's not a get rich quick, or not just indie authors in general, authors period. It's not a get rich quick scheme at first. It's long hours, it's years, it's balancing your finances, it's figuring out what path works best for you. And with the height of social media for bookstagrammers, for book reviewers and authors, it is a benefit, but it's also a negative. And I'll say what I mean is that it's a double-edged sword. Yes, it allows us indie authors and all authors to showcase our work, but now more than ever, there is a little bit of intimidation of, if we're going to be, seen as, oh, he wrote a book, oh, that's fine. Or are people not going to take our book seriously or give it a try? And then that voice, that imposter syndrome, comes into the mind and really derails the author's passion for writing. So I'm curious, Ivette, when you published your book, or even before that, do you have those moments of imposter syndrome, anxiety before and after publication? And if so, what has disciplined you to continue going forward, to hone your craft, to write not just novels, but also short stories and poetry?
So I struggled with huge imposter syndrome. I mean, I started writing Choices of Power May 2011, and it took that long to get it out. And especially, I think, in the last 6 months before I published, it was like, what am I doing? I'm crazy for doing this. Nobody's going to like this. This sucks. I was going through and I'm like, this really sucks. And I was very fortunate to have a lot of people who supported me and who kind of, especially other author friends,
Mhm.
who supported me and who reminded me, like, this is your story. And even if nobody reads it, even if one reader likes it, it was worth it. And
Right.
having to remind myself of that, and having to remind myself that it's worth putting your story out there. It's worth putting my story out there. And
Mhm.
it's different from anybody else's and it's unique to me. That really kept me going. And I also, my kids were watching me. They saw me from the beginning start the story, talk about it, write about it. And if I'm going to tell them, hey, you can do whatever you put your mind to, mom better back it up. So I really had to push myself to do that and tell them, if I tell them, hey, believe in yourself, then I had to look in the mirror and believe in myself. And I think that was the hardest part because, yeah, as an indie author, there isn't the clout of
Right.
traditional publishing, especially
Mhm.
to your family and everybody who doesn't understand what it takes to indie publish. You are pretty
Right.
much your own business. And I didn't even realize that going into it. But once you start getting into that and seeing what your potential is, and sometimes you have to walk away from your work and then just pick up a random piece, and I would pick up a random piece and I would read it and I would say, wow, this is actually pretty good. I actually did this. I did a pretty good job. And you have to pat yourself on the back and say, okay, let me keep going. And I think that's kind of what has kept me going is having people believe in me and having people encourage me. That's the biggest thing. You have to have people who combat the negative in your head.
Absolutely. And I love what you said about, you said telling your kids that you can do anything you want, and you said, I have to back it up. That reminded me of another guest. Shout out to M Fire for this because she told it in her interview, and I thought it was, hilarious. But she's also a parent as well, a mother. And she said that when she was telling her daughter, I forgot what the specifics was of that discussion, but she was telling her daughter, you can do this, you can do this. And her daughter said, and M, comment down below if I get the story wrong, because I want to make sure I get it right. Her daughter said, I'll do this if you write your book. So her daughter called her out and really kind of challenged her to write her story, which she is, yeah, she was happy that her daughter did so because it was, an incredible experience and a very powerful bonding moment, which I think at the end of the day, that's what all of us authors want, is to like have a bond with our readers and to make that connection. As you said earlier in the interview, how your friend's daughter felt like seen and represented in fiction, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And I think now we're going to turn to the business side of being an author. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on these questions, Ivette. So that's a little icebreaker. We'll start with the first question. So, as you've mentioned, you are an indie author going down the self-publishing route. But I'm curious, when you were doing research into publicating your story, Choices of Power, did the idea of traditional publishing come up in the discussion? And now looking back at your first decision, would you have changed anything or changed nothing?
Looking back, first of all, I wouldn't have changed anything. I'm glad I kept myself open. I was looking at not only traditional publishing, but even hybrid, because again, I just wanted to feel that cloud of having, a professionally, everything done professionally and having that
Yes.
I'm traditionally published. But with the elements of my story, a big part of me is my faith, and my faith is interwoven into the story.
Mm.
Um, and even though it's not the most prominent part, it's there. And so when I was researching different things on what to do, I have a great author friend. Her name is AK Nevermore, and she's pretty much my mentor. And she's a few steps ahead of me, and I was talking to her about it, and she was telling me that if you want to keep the essence of your story, the essence of your why, the essence of what you
Mm.
wrote, and have autonomy over it, you might want to think of self publishing because that can get lost in the traditional publishing world. And because I felt so
Yes.
strongly about it and I felt so strongly about what I wanted to convey in my book, I didn't want my voice silenced. I felt like
Right.
for so many years, you know, as a Latina in so many realms, especially when you go into, like, I was in the civil engineering realm, I always felt like my voice had to be small
Mm.
because I was competing with so many different people. And I was pretty much the only female with so many different men. So I just felt like I had to be small. And in this world, I didn't want to be small. I wanted my voice to be heard. And I felt like the best way was to be indie published. And is it hard? Yes,
Yes.
it's not for the faint of heart.
Mm.
You are, again, like I said, it's pretty much a business and you have to take it
Yes.
seriously like a business. Like I brought that, you know, engineering brain and I literally did a spreadsheet of what it would take to break even on my book and know how much to spend into it, but then also knowing to have the freedom of creativity as well. So
Right.
this constant balance. Like I hate the marketing side sometimes
Yes.
because I just want to write. I don't want to have to worry about social media and posting, like you said. Like, does
Yes.
this look right? Does this look good? I'm on Canva for like an hour trying to figure out how to do a video to make it look cool, and I just want to write. But that's what comes with indie publishing. But looking like I said, looking back, I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't do it any other way. I'm glad I did my research. I'm glad I checked because I have my brain is like I have to research all possibilities, and
Right.
indie was the best way for me.
I'm actually glad you made like an emphasis on research, Yvette, because that is very important. Because regardless if you go traditional, hybrid, or indie, it is important to do your research because it's, yes, with indie you do have creativity and ownership and autonomy of your story. But as you said, and as I've said numerous times on the show through various interviews, it's not easy. It's not a get rich quick. It's your own money. You have to balance it out. You really have to figure out, okay, how much am I going to spend for an editor? What kind of edits am I doing with the editor? Am I doing developmental edits, copy edits, proofreading, which are different rates? Each editor has their own rate. So that's a thing to consider, is what editor am I going to use? And then cover artists. That's a huge thing. Are you going to go with a freelance artist who's going to design the cover for either a 9x6 book or 8.5 by 5.5, whatever, or a company? Those are all things to consider. And if you go the traditional or hybrid, it's also important to understand that for hybrid, you have to understand which companies are legitimate and what companies are phonies, because that is a huge thing in the publishing world. Vanity publishing, which I've had a few friends fall victim to that, and it's a difficult fight to reclaim the story. And if you go traditional, yes, traditional is probably what we all aspire to achieve. It's what we all dream of. But what needs to be said, and I'm just gonna flat out say it, if you want to get into like the big five, like Simon and Schuster's, Bloomberg, Penguin Random House, it's not gonna be easy. Probably may not happen. And there's kind of like this gatekeeper mentality of these new stories coming in if they're marketable, because that's a thing too. If you go traditional, you're selling a product to a company that needs to make money. If your book doesn't make money for them, they're not going to take it. That's why a lot of my friends have said, look into the small publishing houses who already have established, audience. Not to say the other big ones don't. They've had years to build up their brand. But as they've mentioned, give the smaller houses a chance, because you may be surprised of what they can do. I had a lot of friends tell me the positive experiences. But at the end of the day, it's the author's choice of what they want to do, whatever they feel works best for them. So
Yes.
with that, yeah. So with that said, now let's go into the other aspect of marketing, which is knowing one's audience and the readership. So let's start with the audience. So Yvette, you said that your book is a YA novel. And I'm curious, when you began crafting the story, did it initially start as a YA story, or did it just begin as a story? But when you went about publishing it or getting ready for publication, did you then have to consider, okay, which age group and which genre am I marketing towards? And do you have a good sense of that from now as opposed to when you just got started with this book?
So when I initially started, I did see my characters as young adults. So about 18, 19, just especially with Simone, she has a bit of a temper. Like she has some growing pains that she has to get through. And so initially they were young adult, but as I actually started writing the story, and there is a romantic element, but it wouldn't be considered romance. It's actually, I guess it would be considered no spice, like vanilla.
Yes.
Like they don't even kiss. I mean, there's
Closed door, one would say.
What was that?
Closed door. I've heard that as like the opposite of spice, where it's not as explicit.
There's pretty much no spice
Okay.
at all. At least in this one, there's no spice at all. Of course, she finds him attractive. You can tell she's in love with him. She mentions things. There's looks, but literally, there's nothing behind closed doors. There's nothing like that. And when I wrote it, I didn't realize that I was writing it that way, but I was also writing it because I thought when I publish this, I want my kids to be able to read it. And when I thought that, I thought if my kids are reading it and I'm sitting in the room with them and they're reading it in front of me, are they going to go, ew, mom, like you wrote this? Like, I didn't want that. I wanted to have that openness where I could feel comfortable with my kids reading it. And that's actually been really refreshing because I have a lot of friends who read it and then they say, it's okay if my kid reads this, right? And I'm like, yeah, they can read it. It's perfect for them if they want to. So if they're, of course, into that sci-fi type of vibe. But yeah, I wanted my kids to be able to read my books, and I didn't want to be embarrassed thinking about it. So there is a romantic element, but it is very innocent.
Yeah, that's actually what a lot of my guests say, who are parents and who wrote like YA novels, that they want their stories to be, you know, passed down to their kids for them to read it and for their kids to read it. And it's a very, you know, delicate balancing act when it comes to YA, as they've told me, for YA novels, especially YA that have just the faintest hint of a romance. Everyone thinks that, oh, it's like romance fantasy, which is like the most read genre and subgenre in the publishing world. And I actually had a guest earlier today say that's like, just because it has a little romance doesn't mean it's like romance fantasy, or it has like these magical elements, but it's existing in what we would say like, you know, urban fantasy or dystopian world, like in our world, not in like a distant planet or a distant land. And they are like, you know, I only make this statement because I had a guest on here said it was a bad experience at first, which is if it's not romance fantasy, or they're going to assume it's romance fantasy because it's a little bit of romance, they will grill into you. And that has turned away one of my friends from ever writing romance fantasy. But it is interesting writing for YA. And also, thing we didn't cover, or I didn't mention, is writing YA characters that are the age they are meant to be. Because I imagine, Ivette, you probably have seen some YA novels where the characters are, let's say, 15 or even 12 years of age, but they're talking like they're 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds. And that's a little unrealistic. And also, going back to spice, there have been some books, one of my friends have said, in the YA community that they're supposed to be YA and have to follow certain criteria and guidelines, but upon reading it, they're more towards the new adult, and you know, they needed a second revision. So for you, what were the challenges of realizing that, oh, this is a YA novel, and kind of like, you know, fitting in the guidelines and parameters where it didn't like hinder you in the process of creativity, but instead allowed you to, you know, still explore the fantasy side, the magical side, and those like the science fiction and, you know, the adult themes, but understanding your audience as well?
So I think one of the most challenging parts with writing YA is I mean, it's a heavy world. I mean, you open the first chapter and something extremely heavy happens to these two young adults. and they pretty much have to take on the role of an adult. And when I was in high school, my mom got really sick, and I pretty much had to take on the role of an adult. And so I had put myself back in that position of balancing the lightheartedness of being a young adult, but also the heaviness of having to act like an adult. So I tried to do that with both Simone and Tremont, where they have these heavy moments, but then they'll crack a joke or they'll be silly with each other or something. So I tried to make sure that that element was still there, because at the end of the day, that's what kids are. Like, I don't want to say kids, but even high schoolers and young adults, they very much have this element of, yeah, things are heavy, but I want to keep it, I want to laugh. I want to have fun too. But I think the hardest part was keeping the romance where it was, keeping it low level. Because, and I'm not going to lie, I get FOMO sometimes. You see the romantic books, you see the spicy books, you see those. I'm like, maybe I should write like that. Maybe I want that. I want to, to get all that cool stuff. They have the romantic cons, they have the romance conventions, they get the cool, pretty looking colors. Like, my colors are really drab. They're pretty much black and gray and brown. And they get like all the pops of colors. And as as a woman, I'm like, oh, I like all that stuff. And I enjoy reading romance, but it didn't align with my why. It didn't align with what I was trying to do. And I feel like that there's a time and a place for that. There's a great, so many awesome authors that do that, and that is their lane and that is their genre. That's not mine. And I had to remind myself, that's not your lane. Stay in your lane, stay in your why, and you'll be just fine. I think that was the hardest part, is not deviating from that, because you want, we're creatives. We want to jump here, shiny new thing, shiny new thing. We have to stay in our lanes in what we're supposed to do, because there are people out there who want to read sci-fi, who want to read dystopian. There are people, there's readers for everything out there. And so as long as there's somebody to write it, there's going to be somebody to read it.
Absolutely. And you actually touched on something that we'll actually talk on later, on, clicks, trends in the publishing world, especially for romance fantasy, which is the most read in the publishing world. But before we get to that, there is a question I did want to ask you, and I think you touched on a little bit of it, but I wonder if you can expand upon it, which is, your individuality and your voice as an author. Now, initially, this question was, who are the authors who inspired you and helped you get your voice? But again, I can't say enough of good things about this. Shout out to Eric Bowden for this, because ever since our interview, like, this question has been probably one of my many favorites, which is, balancing, the reference to the stories that we grew up reading, but also finding our voice. Because as Eric said, that is our main goal. We're trying to showcase our voice, our worth as authors. We're not trying to be like, author of The Fourth Wing, George R. Martin, C.S. Lewis, J.K. Rowling, Shelley Parker Chan, Bernard Cromwell, whoever. We're trying to showcase our voice. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because I imagine that you maybe have, you go with your family to like a bookstore or Barnes and Noble and seen like a book that has said, so-and-so meets so-and-so, or the mix of these two. And from a reader's perspective, that's enticing. That gets us to read. But from an author's perspective, and I now understand it a lot more clearer, that's not really a good thing, because it pigeonholes us into one type of writing, one genre of writing, a tone, world building, characters, etc. And as I said before, we do want to show reverence and respect to the stories that we grew up with, if that's the genre we're writing in. But at the end of the day, the author that is going to be featured in the book is us. It's not anyone else, because we want the reader to say, oh, this is Ivette's book. I now know what to expect with her next one. I know her voice. I know her style of writing. I know how she approaches characters and so forth. So for you, Ivette, how have you been able to balance that sort of scales of the two, between your voice and creativity as an author, but also letting people know through your story and through your characters, these are the books and authors who have inspired me and motivated me in a way.
I love that. Like that is, I feel like I felt like that for a very long time, and you just succinctly said it so well. I hated that because everybody's telling you you have to find comic books, you have to find comic books. I'm like, I don't know what a comic book is. All my people are pretty much have superpowers. Like I don't
Yeah.
know of any other, I don't know of many other books. I actually don't know of any. Probably have to do some digging. But there's always like a certain set of people that have it, but pretty much everybody does. And
Yes.
I liked figuring that out with the whole, well, what would happen if everybody is on the same playing field? What are they going to do to upend that? And it was fun playing with that. But I think that growing up, I loved sci-fi.
Mm.
I was reading Michael Crichton when I was in high school, and I loved his books. And I wanted to be as so scientifically knowledgeable as him. But when you're in YA, you have to remember, like, if you get too heavy into the sci-fi, you're going to lose your reader.
Right.
So it was very hard. And I was also a huge Harry Potter fan. I mean,
Mm.
once the books came out, I was reading them. So when I was writing, I noticed that I was kind of pulling those elements into my writing, and that's
Right.
okay a little bit. But when you notice that it doesn't sound like you, and it sounds like a J.K. Rowling, it sounds like a Michael Crichton,
Right.
then you have to walk away. And I was given this advice by a great author friend: walk away from your work and rewrite that chapter without looking at what you just wrote, and write it just freehand. And that's what I did. And I
Mm.
found my voice that way. And I kind of, because I have a background in poetry, I kind of have this poetic way
Mm.
that I speak that I've noticed in my voice. And at first I thought it was a bad thing, but that is my voice. So I had to go back and change some things in my book and rewrite some areas and make it sound like me, because it was just all over the place.
Definitely. And that is not an easy thing to do. I've struggled with that, for my own books. Like my genre is like historical fiction. Now gotten into fantasy and alternative history. Michael was my first epic fantasy story, and I was a little nervous because I didn't know, thank you. I didn't know how to approach it. Like I've read a lot of fantasy stories, but how do I make mine my own?
Yes.
And I've been working with the characters for so long. It's like I love mythology. I love the characters, and I've never played the game, but Darksiders 1 and 2 were always, a little inspiration for me, because for people who have not read the book yet, I don't mind spoiling the synopsis, but it follows Michael, the Archangel Michael, who brings about the end of the world, and literally heaven falls, all the angels are killed. Lucifer, his wife, they all conquered the earth. And the reason why he's able to do so is that he got the gods and goddesses from other mythologies. So he got all of the villains of their respective lore with him, which is the one thing the angels were not prepared. And so the whole book is Michael trying to recover what he has lost. He gets allies, and it's an interesting dynamic of like an angel meeting a demigod. Like, how would they meet? What would their interactions be? Because angels are very powerful beings in teachings and lore, but how would that pair up against a demigod? Let's say Hercules, or even the god Horus of Egyptian mythology. How would that factor in? And it was a very fun experience, but a very challenging one, because I didn't know, stay in my own lane. Do I stay in history or do I go in fantasy? And honestly, I love writing in both. And that kind of leads into a next question, going to what you said, Ivette, about, choosing one's lane or staying in your respective lane, and, clicks, trends. Because I definitely feel you're right that romance fantasy has, like, the bright colors. You see a lot of that on social media. It's like the things like, closed door romance, found family, and all these other things that get the reader intrigued. They're popular clicks, popular trends that are happening in the publishing world. And sometimes we are tempted to add those into our story when they absolutely don't need it. And this leads to a very, very deep question. So brace yourself, Ivette. There's a lot of buildup to this one, which is, I've been doing YouTube now for 2 years, but podcasting for 5 years since 2018. And now, after interviewing, I want to say 98 authors, with you being the 98, I've come to realize that there's two paths for all authors, which is to be an author and to be known as an author. One is dedicated to storytelling and honing their craft, not motivated solely by capital, but let's be honest, for indie authors, it's nice to get a little money here and there. But the other one, to be known as an author, is an individual dedicated to marketing, going on social media, going on shows like these to showcase their work, get their voice out there. And both routes have their own hurdles and trials, but I definitely feel, and I actually strongly believe, that the second one is the most enticing for first-time authors, because ultimately we want to be known as, authors in our respective genres. But at the end of the day, the hard truth is there's no guarantee in this industry that your first book is going to give you the overnight success you're looking for. There are exceptions to that rule, of course. I've met authors, one of them, Andy Peliquin, whose debut novel skyrocketed him to the status that allowed him to continue his book, as well as write other stories outside of his universe. But generally speaking, you have this roller coaster of highs and lows where you're not motivated by your passion for writing. You're motivated solely by the trends, what's happening in the publishing world, and trying to get a piece of that. And unfortunately, a lot of my authors do agree that is probably the death sentence for all authors. If you want to be a commercial author, a successful commercial author, you really have to understand that mentality. So, Ivette, what is your thoughts on this discussion that there is no guarantee in this industry your first book is going to guarantee you your success, but it should not deter you if that's truly something you want to pursue, if being an author and a storyteller is something you really are passionate about?
So, yes, I completely agree, and that's a very great point. It's something that you don't think about. You automatically, as you're writing, you have the big dreams of, I'm going to be like a J.K. Rowling or Stephen King, just gonna be this awesome person that all the readers love, and everybody's gonna buy your book. And then you realize it hits you pretty quick when you get to that point. Yeah, that's not the reality. And I was very fortunate, like I said, to have an author friend who pointed that out to me before I published. And because I was telling her about, okay, who's going to buy? I got to get more people. I got to worry about this marketing stuff. And she said, if you worry about that, it's going to kill your creative drive. It's going to kill your love and your passion for writing. Yes, you have to balance it as an indie author.
Mm-hmm.
If you focus too much on, one side or the other, if you focus on just the writing, then you're just going to do it as a hobby. And you can for yourself, which is perfectly fine too.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to find that balance, because if you focus too much on the clicks, on the clout, on putting yourself out there, like I said, the FOMO,
Yes.
you'll be a miserable writer. And I didn't want to be a miserable writer. And it is very hard to see so many, to see, and again, I'm a step behind a bunch of people. So to see them doing so well and skyrocketing, but then I had like my author friend, she published 16 books this year alone. Published six, they're like, no, some were novellas, some are full novels. But then again, she's been writing for years and just had them sitting there ready to go. And then boom, it hit. And I'm seeing how there are the highs and lows right now of this first book. There's highs where it comes out and there's a bunch of people that want to get it. And then a month goes by and then there's lows and not as people are buying. And then all of a sudden there's a high because a bookstore wants to sell your book in their bookstore.
Right.
So when those times come where it's something good, even if it's small, I was told, pat yourself on the back, say, great job, celebrate those small wins, and then keep going. Don't get so big headed on those small things and then forget what you're doing. So just learning how to balance that. I'm very much about balance, balancing those two signs out, balancing celebrating small wins while also continuing to work hard. And I think if you do that, then you'll find joy in writing. You may not be. I had somebody say, not everyone can be famous, but everyone can be great. So
Ooh,
maybe
I like that.
yeah, I love that. I've remembered that quote and I've told my kids the quote, and it's it's something that I've had to remember because I might not be the best-selling author of the world, but I can influence the circle that is around me, and that's what I need to focus on. And if I focus on the circle of influence that is around me, then I can be great within that influence and get to the end of my life knowing that I helped people, that I influenced people in a positive way. And that's what I want.
Absolutely. And also to add to that, as you said, the balancing. Also want to make a mention that if you do decide to go down this, direction of, publishing your book, you also have to think, and shout out to Madeline for this response, which is, if you are going to be a writer or an author, do you want to do it solely as a hobby on the side, or do you want to be a commercial writer? Because that is, again, two different mentalities. Writing on the side as a hobby, you are not, confined to schedules that you set for yourself, at least not to like the severe extent where they're set in stone. Let's say, yes, you want to have a book published in the end of the year, but it doesn't come out. It says, okay, I'm going to give myself some time and, refine it and just tell people it's not going to come out yet. And that's fine. But if you want to be a commercial author, then you have to go like, what you're talking about, spreadsheets. Like, okay, I have this book, it's finished, this many words, this is the genre, so forth and so forth. And that is a hustle in and of itself. But ultimately, something that I used to say on the show, which is, initially it was grit trumps talent, but I changed it to where grit becomes talent, because we only get better as time goes on. And it may be your 5th, 10th, 15th, or 20th book that really gets your name out there. Case in point, Natalie Wright, author Seed and the Dragon, that was her 7th book that skyrocketed. That is an incredible story, which I urge you all to go check out my impressions video as well as interview with her, because it was so amazing. And that's actually how I got the inspiration for the question before. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's whatever you want to do as an author. If you want to write as, a hobby, that is fine. If you want to be a commercial writer, that is also fine. Ultimately, understand which one works best for you and that you can manage and balance respectfully and easily, because it is a job, it is a process, and it has to be treated as such. And also, not just that, networking is imperative for authors, especially now on social media where there's a plethora of authors. And speaking of which, Yvette, you've actually name dropped quite a few authors throughout the interview who have helped you understand the business and the industry. Are there any others you'd like to give a mention to who have also helped you on your journey?
So one of the big ones, I actually comment about them in my dedication at the end of my book, is a group called DIY MFA. And
Ooh.
That's exactly as like, I don't have a degree in creative writing. In fact, when I was trying to get into kind of more the journaling aspect, I got an interview somehow. It was this online weird thing, but I got the attention from Soledad O'Brien's team, and I got to go interview her for me and a bunch of other journalists for a segment that she was going to do, and I got to preview it, and it was like so amazing. I'm doing stuff online. I'm not anybody big, and I remember running into these journalists, and they were very much about, oh, well, you're not legit. You need to go to New York and get an MFA there. You have to, get to go to journaling college and whatever. And it really disheartened me. So when I found this group, DIY MFA, Gabriela Pereira is the one who runs it. She's like, anybody can be a writer. You don't have to have a fancy degree. And so through her, I learned a lot about how to structure your story, about the 3-act
Mm.
structure. I mean, I was so green, I didn't even know what a pantser and a plotter was. So
Mm.
I learned so much through her over the last, I want to say 5 years, I think. And then she has a group called The Hub, and we just get together twice a month and just go over craft and go, talk to each other. And so I think that's real, like you said, it's so, so important to have those group of people that you can learn and that you can glean
Mm-hmm.
from. So that's another person besides my friend AK Nevermore, who the one who published 16 books. She's a rock star. Yeah, she's like, don't do what I do. I'm crazy, but she's awesome too. She's literally, I would not have been able to publish without her. She pretty much gave me step by step what to do. I just followed her lead, and I didn't do everything perfect, but I was successful because of her and her lead and her help. So yeah, definitely.
Awesome. And kind of as like a special question, I don't really ask this question a lot in my interviews, but I'm always curious for the answer. So, have you ever gotten a sense of validation from your peers? Because, just like in the workforce, when we take our knowledge that we learned in school or a trade school and we apply it to the workforce, it's one thing to do the work, but it's another thing to be recognized for the work by your peers, and especially in the author community, that is a real special thing. And not a lot of people, seek validation, like that's their main goal. But it's nice when your work is recognized. So I'm curious, Ivette, have you ever had that experience with an author you've admired, or just an author that just purchased your book, messaged you, and said, "This is an amazing story. You're an incredible author"?
So yes, I think and I very much like to be validated. I'm a reforming people pleaser, I promise. I'm really trying. But it is nice to be validated, and I'm learning that the validation, I can't let that go to my head, but more along the lines of, am I going in the right direction?
Right.
So, AK Nevermore, the reason why I'm such a huge fan of hers is while she's publishing all these books, she requested my draft for Choices of Power. And she
Mm.
went through it and she said, you have a great story here. You need to just tweak these things. And she gave me all this advice on what I needed to do to get that validation of, this is a good story. Keep up what you're doing. Just fix this. Was great. Um, the DIY we just had a critique group last week,
Mm.
and I submitted the beginning of my chapter 5 to them for the second book of Choices of
Right.
Power. So the next book will be Struggles of Power, that I'm planning
Mm.
to release next year. Indie author, planning to release. We'll see. That deadline always moves, but it's there. And I'm a little frustrated with Struggles of Power, the second book, because it's like it's all in my head, but it's just not coming out onto the paper. And so when I submitted it, I'm like, I don't know if this is going the way I want it to go. And I got such great feedback from all of my peers that it was, even Gabriella said, it's really hard to find something to critique because this is actually a really great piece. And I'm like,
Right.
oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that because, doubting myself, imposter syndrome, like, yeah, I
Hmm.
came out with one book, but can I come up with a sequel?
Yes.
Was so great to hear that because I'm like, okay, I was so down on myself. And it was just great to hear that so I could pick myself back up and get right back into writing and stop trying to fix everything and just say, okay, this is where I need to go. This is the way I need to go, and I'm good to go.
That's awesome and 100% true. And I'm glad your friends have given you that advice and have helped you grow as an author and as a person too. So now, as a final cap note to this interview, Yvette, with everything you've learned thus far from your friends, family, fellow authors, and your own personal journey, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors watching and or listening to this interview right now?
I love that question. I think it's so important to relay our knowledge to other authors, upcoming authors. And I will say, and you've touched on it already, is having a community. Like I said, you gain so much from a community. You glean from them. They become your mentors. They become your mastermind of people who guide you and, you know, help you along the way. And when you're feeling down about yourself and not sure if you're doing it right, they lift you back up. And I think if you know, I always thought this was a solo thing
Right.
before. You know, I thought, okay, well, I'm just a writer and I'm going to do this by myself. I don't need anybody else. Everybody else is competition. And that's how we see it. And I think that's how it was put to me by Gabriella. She's like, your reader is going to read your book within a week. You don't have another book, so they're going to read another author's book. You're not competing with each other. You guys need to complete each other and help each other out.
Absolutely.
The biggest lesson I've learned, and it has been the most vital to my success at publishing. And I know it will be the thing that keeps me succeeding in the future. So I would say find a community of authors. If you can find somebody local, that's great. Because of my work schedule and family stuff, I have to do everything virtual. Like DIY MFA, they're virtual. And I have friends on social media, and they're in the Florida area, other authors, but they're kind of at a distance. And they've been reaching out to me about, you know, getting together and collaborating. When you do that, you will see how much farther you can go.
Right.
Just you find so many more opportunities that you don't know are available because you're one person. So when you have so many other people helping put things into your mind and helping you out, it's amazing what you can come up with. And that's what I think is the most important. Community, community, community.
And I could not agree more, Ivette. And with that, we will end this amazing late night author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. Now, before we officially end for the night, I want to give a huge thank you to Ivette for coming on the show and telling us all about choices of power. And Ivette, where can people find you on social media to interact, engage, as well as where can people buy copies of Choices of Power?
So a lot of all my information is on my website, IvetteNDiaz.com. I'll spell that out because my name is spelled different than most people. It's I, V as in Victor, E, T as in Tom, T as in Tom, E, N November, D David, IAZ.com. And there you can find links to my books, which are on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Smashwords, Apple, on a lot of them. And then also my socials. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and it'll be under Ivette N Diaz. You know, all the socials, Goodreads, LinkedIn. Trying to stay off Threads. I might just succumb to it. There's just way too many socials. And if you go onto my website and sign up for my newsletter, you do get the free novella, which is the prequel to Choices of Power called Rise of Power. And that one is, I've gotten some great feedback on that one too as well. So yeah, so I appreciate you having me very, very much. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
I'm glad you enjoyed yourself, Ivette, and I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And also, as a little bit of promotion myself, I am also still accepting signups for my beta read application for my fourth book, Decimus the Wolf of Rome, which if you're a fan of alternative history, historical fiction, a little bit of fantasy, and if you just love giant wolves just ripping apart enemies, as we've seen in a lot of other media, you will definitely enjoy Decimus the Wolf of Rome. So definitely check it out down below. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for another late night author interview for the month of November. I'm so excited for all the guests I've met thus far. A huge thank you to Ivette for coming on the show. We wish her the very best. And this will not be the last time she'll be on the show. I plan to have her back sometime in the new year to discuss any upcoming books, whether it's short stories, novellas, or poetry, or a little teaser of the second book. So just make sure to follow both of our social medias to stay up to date. And as always, like, comment, and subscribe. And let us know down below what is your favorite dystopian story in the comments. As always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you a wonderful evening, viewers and listeners, wherever you are in the world.